Good evening, or good morning, because tuning in from Australia or East Asia. Welcome to Intellectual Publics. We're coming to you from the Graduate Center at CUNY in New York. I'm Ken Wissaker, and I direct the program, along with Stephanie Gayette. We're gathered here virtually in a time of intensifying crisis in the US, one that threatens to harm people and countries around the globe. Graduate students being snatched off the streets, autism support tattoos being grounds for sending Latinx persons to unmonitored prisons in other countries, the National Endowment for the Humanities being decimated, or so it was reported today, Northwestern removing the website of its Women's Center just to be in compliance with something, events at different scales and levels, each contributing to a rising sense of fear, as they are intended to do. All this was promised in advance. Yet even with the details laid out for anyone who looked, the election had this result. White nationalism, sexism, anti-Black racism all certainly played their parts, as did mass media, our disgraced hometown newspaper especially, and new media as well. But at a deeper level, how do we begin to understand what is happening? Many have gone back to Arendt or to thinkers from mid-century, mid-1900s, I guess, trying to explain the rise of fascism in Germany, Italy, or Japan. Brian Massumi wonders if there might be a better way, more tied to the society and social theory of the present. His brand new book, The Personality of Power, A Theory of Fascism for an Anti-Fascist Life, offers us this different way of thinking about Trump's appeal and what makes it effective. He'll be talking tonight with the equally brilliant Katie Stewart, who has had a career of inventing new ways to characterize and convey the political present. The original milieus of philosophy and ethnography may be different, as are their forms of theory writing, but their dedication to thinking in ways that might be more politically helpful in our moment is deep and shared. We're in for something really special. The thinking we need so badly at this moment. Brian Massumi is the author of numerous works across philosophy, political theory, and art theory. Brian and I first worked together on Parables of the Virtual, for the Virtual, now in its 20th anniversary edition, just as a way of offering a time frame. His publications include the just published Personality of Power, 99 Theses for the Revolution of Value, a post-capitalist manifesto from 2018, and Couplets, Travels in Speculative Pragmatism from 2021. With Aaron Manning and Three Ecologies Project, he participates in the collective exploration of new ways of bringing philosophical and artistic practices into collaborative interaction. Kathleen Stewart is Professor Emeritus of Anthropology at the University of Texas, Austin. She writes on affect, the ordinary, and modes of attunement based on speculative curiosity. A Space on the Side of the Road, Cultural Poetics in and Other America, Princeton, from 1996, portrays a dense and textured layering of sense and form laid down in social use. Ordinary Affects, which Duke published in 2007, maps the force of present moments as lived as imminent events. The Hundreds, with Lauren Berlant, Duke from 2019, is a writing experiment in dwelling in history of the present. Her current work, Worlding, approaches generative ways of collective living through sensing out what happens. You know what I mean? Brian and Katie will talk for an hour or so, and then we will take some questions. The chat is open, webinar format, but please put your questions into the Q&A where we can find them more easily. Brian, Katie?
Brian, thank you for this gift of a book.
Well, thank you for agreeing to this conversation.
My
I'm
pleasure.
really happy to be here with you.
Yeah, me too. I think of it almost as a Bible of fascism, your book. like a Bible in that you can go back and forth, you read passages, you read another section, you're returning to things, new things are happening. It's a major, major resource for us. Thank you so much. I wanted to start by talking about the feeling of the prescience of this book now in the present, as a kind of feeling that, and I was thinking about why is that so, other than just the obvious facts of the situation we're in. And I think it's also because of the way that you closely follow the dynamic tendencies of what was already on the move in Trump's early years in the first movement. And now those things that were on the move are fast materializing in an amplification, like a world sound system that's unavoidable. But also the book is an approach to modes of thought in a world under pressure. And that, of course, is also now intensified by actual worldly decompositions that we're in the midst of. In many ways, the personality of power is, for me, an affective theory of singular life and its violent suppression. And that's a lot, and we're reeling. So the reaction to the first Trump election was captured for me in T-shirts that read, "Think while it's still legal." And this now seems like a stable, well-tempered voice in a relatively and time-delineated liberal world. The reaction after this election seems better captured by the viral video of a man rhythmically shouting, "We fucking told you so. We fucking told you so," over and over. This crisis ordinary is existential, as you argue, and I think even elemental, training itself on the breaking elements in the thing that is Trump land. And I just want to say a few things about the subjects here, and elemental subjects feeling their way out in what's happening that makes us constitutively open to otherness, which is a major theme in your thinking about subjects in this book. What you and Aaron Manning called thought in the act is alert and attuned, like Andre Debussy's bouncer in a strip club who can spot pockets of possible trouble, quote, in the details of those dark human spaces in the room where something has just changed. A man lets out an appreciative yell where before he was silent. One of the dancers on the floor laughs a little too hard or steps back too fast. A chair leg scrapes the carpet, a shift of objects in the space, a change in the air. Capacities are called up for subjects that are being fielded in this way. The subject as an exposure that never quite returns to itself. Like the groundhog I once watched, weight suspended at the edge of a field, feeling out a smell on the breeze, the bare beginning of a movement in the trees, before making her mad dash to her den under the building at the other end of the vast opening. Or the pregnant Ecuadorian migrant Jordan Salama described in The New Yorker. She runs at 5 a.m. down the middle of a street in the Bronx to avoid the hisses of crazy men at the start of her long commute to the cookie factory in New Jersey. The prescience of your book, in other words, is maybe not just that its arguments are being borne out, but that the mode of sensing out threats and potentials your method enacts is now central to the ways of being for us. We seem to be already becoming differently under fascism. I wonder if you think that. But anyway, it must have been interesting and alarming for you to move from the finished book to what is happening now.
Yes, there's certainly been a change in the air. And retrospectively, you could say that the book is prescient about that. I think that's overstating it. I think that anecdote you said about the man with the T-shirt saying "We fucking told you so." It strikes me a little bit like everyone suddenly having always opposed the war in Iraq years after it became clear that it was a disaster. I don't think people were telling us so. But I also didn't think that I was that prescient at the same time, because actually, to the very end, I held out hope that Trump wouldn't be reelected and that we wouldn't be here.
Right.
I couldn't believe that it could happen. But what I was trying to do was diagnose tendencies that can move in fascist directions. Felix Guattari wrote a really interesting essay back in the 70s, which he called Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist. And he said that fascism is present everywhere all the time in bits and pieces, and every once in a while it catalyzes, and then it braces into the entire social field. And I wanted to try to talk about what those tendencies might be and how they were operating, because even shy of a catalytic point like that, there are a lot of reasons to fight against them. And you need to be vigilant in case that's coming. I don't think it's really predictable when or if it is coming. But because those tendencies involve creating sharp boundaries between self and other, between nation and stranger, because there's a kind of retribution rage against people perceived as other than oneself, and a kind of bringing the power of the state and the power of rhetoric violently down upon people that need to be, for one reason or another, from that point of view, excised from the social body, or at least silenced. So even shy of the catalytic point, it's an important battle. And I think what's hard is that fascism is not one thing. Fascism is something that recurs, like revolution. It recurs with variation. Every variation is going to be different. And if you try to understand it based on the templates we have from the past, you're going to miss it, because it has an amazing ability to adapt itself to current conditions and draw itself back out from conditions that are changed. There's no constants in it. So that was the problem I wanted to think about. You know, I remember reading a couple of historians or theorists of fascists who said, don't worry, Trump is not fascist. You know, look what happened in Italy and in Germany in the 20s and 30s. This isn't this. We're not moving toward fascism. But that really underestimated fascism's power to reinvent itself, and it underestimated its dispersive nature, that it is in bits and pieces throughout the social field. And those bits and pieces are waiting for the little triggers, the little cues and primes that will allow them to join together into larger confluence. So I wanted to think about tendencies and think very seriously about what constituted a tendency, how to diagnose them.
Yeah.
And then also I wanted to try to, as you mentioned, as Ken mentioned, try to get out of the model of charismatic leadership that we've inherited from the 20th century. And we can talk more about that.
Yeah, I think that relationship between diagnosing tendencies and things being able to throw together that are surprising or you couldn't believe it could happen is a really interesting one in your work, because you're being very specific in discovering what these tendencies were in Trump, in fascism, as it was unfolding. I guess historically you were thinking about it, but it's also really a philosophical exercise in thinking about a dynamic system where all of these tendencies as come into a kind of mutual modulation and become something.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a model of what a system is. You use the word structure too, quite
Yeah.
as well as personality, both of which seem like they might be from some other model than process philosophy, and yet they fit this case perfectly.
Yeah, well, I think the point of view from process philosophy is that subjects, the way we think of them as sort of enclosed agential entities that have a particular boundary between them and the world and have kind of a rational capacity um, uh, to govern their own actions, and the way we think about structures as some kind of underlying architecture um, that, in a sense, preforms the world. Both of those ways don't work in process philosophy, which sees those as results. So it's not saying that there isn't the creation of subjects who experience themselves and as uh, that kind of enclosed bourgeois subject and act accordingly in a lot of ways, and that there aren't certain structures that settle into the power relations in society and create certain repetitive functions that are sort of thrown down over bodies and over the social field. But the point is that those are derived functions, that they're emergences, and they emerge from a field of emergence that doesn't have the same organization that they have. That's more, the word you used before was very apt, more elemental. And that to the extent that structures endure, and to the extent that we feel our structured selves enduring, it's not because they actually have, but it's because they're always able to catch themselves when they start falling back into the cracks and leaking back down to this level of emergence from which they came. So they're always bootstrapping themselves back into a repetitive pattern, and they recognize themselves in that pattern. But can be a chancy undertaking. It's always, in a sense, an achievement, but it's also a danger, because that field of emergence, which consists of all of the very, very complicated, complex relations and differentials, tendencies that are vying and rubbing shoulders in society without necessarily having to come to full expression yet, that are looking for an outlet to expression, that are looking for allies or looking to interfere with others to make room for themselves. There's a large domain of commotion and even struggle that is not reflected directly at the structural or the structured subject level. That hits at that level as a kind of perturbation from the outside. And then the structure or the subject has to reorganize themselves, they have to catch themselves, reorganize themselves around that interruption and draw themselves back into the pattern in which they recognize themselves.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's almost like the elements have personalities in the way that you talk about them. They have to bootstrap themselves. They look for prompts and cues. What are these things? I was thinking about them when you were talking about history, or these elements, being in bits and pieces, living in various ways over time and resurging in a fascist formation. But it does raise the question for how we think about these things. And your book really made me try to think about what these elements are. How do we characterize these things? And so I was thinking about, like, in the American history of right-wing force fields and movements, how clearly they come and go and return, just as you're saying. And people think that the religious right is over, but it's not. It goes into some other domain and starts working on school boards and so on, and then comes back in a bid for majority status. Or especially for me, the specific languages of moral panics that, have peppered the history of the US from the beginning and got very intense in the 90s with satanic panic and the daycare scandals, and directly led to the Pizzagate language and QAnon's language. So you have these, again, these bits and pieces
Mhm.
coming back. Or do they live? I mean, they do live in some way. So it's an interesting question. How do they live? Where do they live? Do we see them? There's a model where of them being submerged or subsumed in what used to be the hegemony, and now there's a new hegemony, and so they're all front and center and reanimated and re-energized. But you do get a sense, looking at the history of these things, that they exist in some form over long periods of time.
Mhm. Yeah, well, in the book, I spent a lot of time trying to develop a new concept of personality that does allow me to say that sub or infra subjective happenings can be said to have a personality of their own. It sounds very strange.
Yeah, it's interesting.
But the idea is sort of that there's levels within levels that filter up to a unified feeling on top that sums them up without taking all of their details into itself, but its complexion in some way carries their traces. So it's a global overall effect that can carry this massive set of differentiations, but only partially expresses it. To try to go back a little bit to the idea of tendencies, what I talk about as tendencies are very simply anything that carries a potential through a journey toward its realization, whether it reaches that realization or not. So a potential is directed. I mean, a tendency is directed. It has a certain orientation. You could say that there's an attractor state that is pulling it forward from the future, as well as sets of conditions that are pushing it from the past and pushing it from behind. A potential starts to gel embryonically. It's pushed and pulled over thresholds where it starts taking form. And it can come to expression, but on the way, it has to elbow its way past a lot of other tendencies or find ways of accommodating itself to. So it's still abstract, but the key terms are potential and tendency.
Mm-hmm.
So starting from those rather than fully fledged subjects and things. And then one of the biggest tendencies in our lives is the tendency to form habit. And what a habit does is bring together a certain set of conditions, and it creates that kind of tendential unfolding that self-affects it automatically triggers given the correct conditions. And it creates a transition where something happens. We usually aren't conscious of them, but in some way we feel them, we feel their effects. Now that pulling together of strands into an unfolding to create a global effect, which isn't the same as the strands, but wouldn't be anything without them. It carries their mark, but doesn't resemble them. You could call that a little person.
That's so
You call a person a kind of global pop-out effect of a moving complexity that is availing itself of potentials in order to move through certain lines of development. And the philosophers I draw on do exactly that. They talk about habits as little souls. It's a word of Deleuze's. Charles Sanders Peirce says that a general idea is a little person, and the habit is the first sketch of general ideas, because they're general in the sense that they cover over a spread of conditions, bringing it into its own unified effect and its own unified outflowing. Mm-hmm. So I start with that elemental definition of personality and then try to understand how that moves up through different levels and strata to the level that we recognize as ourselves, and what's left of the complexity, and what's left of the potential, and what's left out, and what happens to the left out potential. I lost my train of thought, but so then I guess in relation to Trump, it's a way of rethinking theories of identification, where normally you start on the psychological level of fully formed individuals who are sort of face to face in some way through social interaction. They recognize each other. They can mimetically vie with each other, and they project their desires onto each other and have others' desires projected onto them. And when you think of a preeminent person like Trump, who occupies a nodal point in the social field, then that ends up being a theory of projective identification on that central point. And it assumes that there's a kind of becoming the same, or a kind of similarity between them. And I just don't think that's really the case.
No.
I think that something much more complicated is going on.
Well, you use the word that they're adjoined to him. So he's the personification and impersonation of a collective individuation, you're saying. And one that gives license. And it's you talk about it as a transpersonal desire rather than issue of interests, obviously. And that it's passional. It's a passional connection to that personality of power that is Trump. They love him because he's doing. That's it. He just has to act, and they love him. They don't love Musk in the same way.
Yeah.
So I was really interested in that concept you have of adjoining to the thing, even though the thing itself is the Trump itself is as a fake. It's a beloved fake. It's a machinic knockoff of himself. You know, he says he's an actor is what he is. Mm-hmm. And his followers are not then just identified with him, but something else more complicated and more intense, or something new, something different from identity seems to be happening here.
Yeah, I think if it were a question of identity, there'd be a confirmation around a norm, and that's really not what's happening. I'm convinced that we're in a post-normative situation, not in the sense that the old norms have left, but that there's a kind of fluidity around them that actually serves them. So Trump isn't the normative strongman who is a man of steel, someone you can trust, who's solid and follows through, who has that kind of ability to project a will in a straight line toward a goal that represents the uprightness of the human, but more specifically of the masculine ideal. I mean, if you describe Trump in those terms, it's sort of laughable. A number of commentators that I quote in the book talked about him as being a kind of being catty, being a Karen, being whimpering and whining,
Right.
wearing his vulnerability on his lapel, and then trying to overcome it with attacks toward other people. So he's oscillating between extreme vulnerability and acts of decision directed against other people. He's sort of playing the field of a kind of somewhat destructured masculinity. So what I thought of, so it didn't make sense to me that the masculine egos of the young men around the world suddenly recognized them as their ego ideal and glommed onto him through identification.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed to me instead that he was creating a field of oscillation of masculinity that was a kind of attracted bodies to itself in different capacities, and that there was a certain dynamic that was being acted out through that, and that they were starting to, that people had that dynamic already in themselves in embryonic form and were developing it through joining into the dynamic that Trump personifies. So Trump became a kind of over person, just like I was talking about these elemental sort of individual persons of habits and tendencies at various levels that resume themselves, that summarize themselves in an overall pattern that has a certain feel and a certain sense of unity to itself that we call a personality. Just as there are the sub-personalities within the personality, our individual level personalities are sub-individuals, are sub-persons within Trump. And Trump can't be thought of only as the individual Trump, the man, the biological living man, because he is supplemented, he's pre-supplemented. He comes with embodying a certain kind of capitalism. So part of the dynamic that people are joining to is a certain form of unhinged capitalism. He cannot live without the constant back and forth of social media. In his first term, he spent 8 hours a day tweeting, and they called it executive time. So that was the executive time, decision time was his tweeting time. He echoed the right-wing social media sphere, and he talked back to it, sent back its own echoes in a kind of circular relay. So he was supplementing himself through that relay, through the media. And Trump, the person, is that in its entirety. He would be nothing without that. It seemed to me that he needed to become president again, because if he didn't, he would simply be he'd be a private person again, and he would simply be a man. Whereas if he continued as president, and now he wants to continue for a third term and be perpetual president, his augmented personality of an over person whose personality sums up and in a certain way unifies dynamics in the entire social field would continue. And going back to tendencies, I think none of this can really work conceptually unless you talk about what some of the major tendencies are, and as they move through Trump. And I decided to think about the term reaction from the term reactionary, obviously, but also in a much more elemental sense. And a lot of the book is trying to create a concept of reaction that like fascism, which people said was just an insult and not a serious term. Call someone talk about reaction or regime of reaction, or talk about reactionary dynamisms. There's the same tendency to dismiss it as exaggeration or petulance. But I wanted to make real working concepts of those two ideas, and the tendency toward reaction, I think, is the one that becomes dominant, and that's what that's the dynamic that people are joining their own life dynamisms to through Trump.
And we are also reactive now, would you say?
And we are definitely reactive now. I don't think reaction and reactivity is anything that any life is without, or perhaps even can do without. So it's a question of how it's channeled and how dominant it is over other tendencies.
That feels like that change between the think, well, it's still legal and we fucking told you so, though, that it's we, the losers, are reactive in a way that is it self-irritating and surprising. Again, back to the hegemony of the temporarily liberal state or liberal world, where things were stable compared to what is happening now. And it's almost a sense of law. It's a sense of outrage at being pulled down from that place, which of course does not apply to everyone. This has not been everyone's experience in the history of the US to have been in a safe place to begin with. So we have a crisis of liberalism too, it seems to me. You talk about how the liberal concepts of reflective thought and even belief don't do a lot of work here. It's not a way to approach what is happening in fascism.
Yeah, I think when Guattari said fascism is everywhere, when he entitled in bits and pieces, and when he entitled his essay, Everybody Wants to Be a Fascist, he meant it. And that means it's in the left, it's in progressives, it's in us. And one of the best reasons to really think about how what fascism is a kind of unleashed regime of reaction, is to be able to diagnose it in ourselves in order to short circuit it. So when I talk about reaction, there's a lot of development in the book around it, and for me, it went back to try to do it fairly briefly. It went back to ideas in Spinoza, where he says that, well, I would say, if you're thinking about an individual life, we're talking about it as a nexus that's very complex, that's open to impingements from the outside. It's always greeting and selecting and filtering through potentials into tendencies, building those tendencies into habits, building the habits into the basis of a more or less stable everyday life. There's a kind of radical openness to impingement, to otherness, because every moment starts with a shift of attention, a slight interruption, a slight shift from the moment before, and in that crack, you can see the bottomlessness of that potential, the field of experience. So Spinoza says that there's a necessary tendency in perception when it experiences an impingement, which could be any kind of interruption, but especially a potentially painful or anxiety-producing one, that there's a tendency to subtract the effect on us, on our body, on our life, from the relational field that that impingement came from, and to sort of indulge ourselves in that feeling of having been impinged upon. This is happening at a kind of infra-moment, not really in a measurable moment of time. But he says that we subtract the effect and it stays with us as a trace. We have a tendency to lash out at the most proximate object that seems to be the cause of that impingement. And then we blame it. And there's, as the causal agent of pain. And there's already a kind of primitive moral sense in that. Mm-hmm. And what he's saying is that nothing is ever that simple. There's never just one linear cause and one body. It's never just an effect on the body. The body is also taking in the impingement, rearranging itself around it, resisting it. If there is a locatable punctual body that impinged, it comes from a very complex set of conditions and contexts. So if you want to talk adequately about a cause, you're talking about that entire relational field, but that the impingement and then the blame reaction and the nursing of the trace of that wound is the birth of reaction. And well, there are a lot of social mechanisms or personal mechanisms where we hang on to that and we weave those effects together and create a kind of general posture toward the world that's already steeling ourselves for impingement and thinking not of the entire relational field and what might happen if we could access potentials otherwise and tweak it otherwise. We get focused on the impinging body, and we usually identify that by a certain property, and then we focus on that property as the blameworthy element. That property is often in our society skin color. Then we have a category of people supposedly defined by that property. And the scary or painful or resentful effects infuse the category, but the category also falls back down on the individual, and the individual is judged by the category through the category rather than being experienced for itself. Mm-hmm. And an individual body is a particular instance of this general category, this general rule. And when our thinking gets caught in that loop between the general and the particular, then we're not able to go back in the fine detail or experimentally, tweakingly, to see what else is up, what else is around, what else can happen in the relational field, how we can strategize it how we can sidle it differently to bring out different effects. We steel ourselves against these effects that we're already on the alert for, and it can become a sort of an obsessive seeking out of potential impingements of the same nature. So what's being lost, you used the word singularity in the very beginning, what's being lost is the singularity of the complexity of the relational field, the multiplicity of its tendencies and elements, and the fact that there are always other potentials that are couched in that field that could be brought out into tendency, into habit, and developed in other ways, counter to reaction. Nietzsche talks about ressentiment as reaction being developed into an existential posture where everything hurts. The world is a pain. The world is is a constant source of impingement and a constant source of resentment. And we tend to nurse often those resentments. But what Spinoza says is that that tendency to take the effect on the body, separate it out, and then feed it forward into discourse and intellectual thinking in that framework of the general and the particular that carries traces of pain and moves them through your life and through society. That is actually part of a natural part of perception that everybody has, and that we can't pride ourselves on somehow having escaped it, because it is actually a very adaptive function. If you're crossing a street, you want to be able to single out from the complexity of the traffic the car that could be impinging against your body. If you're going to be attacked by a lion, you want to be able to separate out that from the field. So what he says is that those reactions and those traces are always there. We can't undo them. They are illusions, but they're objective illusions in the sense that they're built into our lives and into the field of our lives in ways that do capture something that is true, is accurate to a certain extent. So what he says is that instead of nursing the traces and operating between the general and the particular in that way, that you have to move into the thinking of the singularity and the complexity of situations and refract those traces through each other to the point that they start weaving in with other potentials. And you have to start thinking of the potentials carried by the impinging bodies and how else they could be, and how else the conditions and other bodies around them that made them what they were, what they could carry differently. And you create a sense of the relational field that includes you alongside others, and in a sense brings you into a different viewpoint over the field. So, and that viewpoint can envelop the reactive traces and the reactive reactions, the errors of attribution, of blame. It can, in a sense, deactivate them in favor of a broader view.
Right. Well, you're making me think about how people have to deactivate reaction, or there are desires to do that. I'm thinking about storytelling, the way that people tell stories, and they're often funny and making fun of themselves. Like they have to be careful, not to be too trumped up in their stories, unlike Trump. And I was also thinking about in this world that we're in now, this, I call it the shit show, that the reaction against the opposite side, you don't know who you're talking to. There's always a watching for who is this person, that seems to have become much more active, at least in my case, than before. These forces of reaction are continuous and make people not want to talk to people or be in certain situations. And I was at BJ's the other day, which is a place that I hate, and I don't know why I was there. So already, what am I doing here? And I make contact with this guy because he's making noise. And then I feel like we're in it. We're in something. A contact has been made, and it has to do with reaction. He's yelling. There are empty shelves in the store. Where are the eggs? Where's the frozen vegetables that are supposed to be on sale? And I'm like, yeah, because I'm connecting to him, right? I'm just trying to see what's happening here. And then he tells me my wife yells at me for yelling at the workers, and I say, well, yeah, it's not them, it's And then we end the sentence together with the word corporate, right? So he's also coming with me
Mhm.
into something. And then there's some story about some meat. He continues. There's some meat that he saw the stalker putting on the back of the shelf, but the stalker said, we're not allowed to sell that until tomorrow. And he says, what the fuck? And then I start to feel like he's following me. Somebody's following me. It turns out to be just Ron, my partner. But then the guy is there also when we go to the checkout, and he's obnoxiously alert to a woman who's buying packs of snacks and water for every single class in a school and the library, and there's no tax. And he doesn't say anything, but I feel it in his body, as you were saying. And I hate the way that he then is making a drama out of holding the thread of his own body and head together from some ragged edge of the social. And I'm alarmed, to be in this contact that I have initiated with this person. So I feel
Mhm.
like, like in a bad situation, a bad relationship or something, you can become overreactive, where you can never calm your senses. And I feel like that is happening.
I think that's definitely happening more and more. There's a kind of industrial scale production of narratives through conspiracy theory that develops the reactive hatreds against certain groups,
Mhm.
that has a kind of manic need to continue to generate new narratives around the same themes, never really finding anything new, just finding variations on what was already the foregone conclusion, who the culprits were, what kind of activities behind the scenes are responsible for them. And there's sort of a carrying of reactivity through narrative on a massive scale through the media and through social media. And that settles into the situations of our everyday lives. And there's there are practices of counter narratives that, for example, in your own work, is a great example of that um, burrows into situations where there are encounters happening across differences with a number of contributory factors, not all of which are necessarily felt clearly, not all of which are necessarily known, but have
Right.
some kind of bearing on the situation, so that the situation is singular, even though you could put it into a genre like going to the grocery store.
Right.
And I think that a counter narrative of that complexity might be able to start loosening a bit the linear connection between impingements and reactions and narrativization
Mhm.
in
Yeah.
the same way. Even in this example where you were talking about this sense of reactivity in yourself and reacting to the obnoxiousness of the man. I think he even used the word hate. Um, there's a lot more going there because you created an encounter, right?
Yeah. And I would do it again
And you would do it again
every single time.
because for you, it's not a foregone conclusion that it has to end up as it did in that particular instance. Maybe there was something in his body, maybe there's something in the way you could tweak the way you made the encounter, maybe there's something in the surroundings that could deviate the situation slightly. So is there a way of attending to the singularities of situations, no matter how generic they seem, to try to have a sense, a sort of a thinking feeling of the potentials that lie in that complexity, and to try to suspend our immediate reactive tendencies. Sometimes we have to fall back on them, because if the situation doesn't have that flexibility, if the other people are imposing a reactive situation on you, there's often very little you can do but react back. It's something that's very hard very hard to avoid. And sometimes it's necessary for resistance just to keep your own margin of maneuver going.
Right. And now we're talking about the anti-fascist life. This is a theory of fascism for anti-fascism. And there are issues here about modes of critique for academics for approaching these objects, which I think your book is really phenomenal in doing, because you're producing in these little sections of the book. There's 150-ish sections of the book where you're picking up a certain element, a certain tendency, and it's, to me, it's like the singularity of having an encounter on a philosophical plane. It's like you're producing an encounter in philosophy. Here's what we do. We do these elements that are in a dynamic relationship to each other. We're moving back and forth through them. There's a kind of a repetition as we begin again with something else. And I was thinking about the way that we are trying to get out of the noxiousness of the news. And many people did it by jokes, by watching the comedians, and that something soured with that somewhat. Why? Because they were imitating Trump. Everybody got very, very good at imitating his body and his voice, especially, right? That became a very easy, habitual thing. And we seemed to be reaching a point where his own self-caricatures are replacing the space of what you were talking about as the cracks, where satire or comedy can get a foothold, because he's already occupying that space. So the performance is already occupying that space. And you also talked about interruptions, and you're making me think about like when Marjorie Taylor Greene was refusing to take a question from a British reporter because she was British. And she said, go back to your country, put up her hands. No, I'm not talking to you. The moderator tried to say, answer her question. And she said, no, I'll answer it if you ask it because you're an American. And she got louder and louder. And it was a refusal to be interrupted. There was also this ridiculous viral video that went around about the new Deputy Director of Homeland Security who was being interviewed by NPR for why they had arrested the Colombian graduate student. And he had a little story that was, it was as if it was written in his eyelids. And you see this over and over again in the Trump administration, where there's a one line that they've been given. These people who don't know anything about the situation that they're in, right? And he said, well, he came in on a visa that was a student visa. He entered a contract. That's a contract. And he didn't say he was going to be a terrorist. And she was saying, well, is there any evidence of a terrorism? What is he being charged with? And he's not on a student visa, and he's not an illegal alien, and he's a, blah, blah. And none of that penetrated him. What he did instead was to repeat over and over and over again the same one line. I don't know if you saw that.
Yes, yeah, I did.
Yeah. As I said, he said, as I said, he came in this way and he entered a contract not to be a terrorist. And so there's such a force in the performativity of of the fascism that it seems like it's difficult for the press or even comedians to get a foothold in there to crack it open. In my film club this week, we watched Dr. Strangelove, made in 1964 as a parody, as a satire of the nuclear system, right? And we all had the same reaction, which was that it wasn't funny, that we couldn't even get a giggle out of it because there's no more distance between that system and a space where you can view it.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, Green was reacting to that person. Trump is reacting, for example, to Canada based on certain categories. The person's ethnicity put him in the category enemy. The way the circulation of impinging signs that bring sort of reactive encounters to people play out is constantly bringing them back to the fear of, to a description of the enemy according to general categories. So it wasn't the question that the reporter asked, it was her nationality. It wasn't the fact that the reasons for what Trump is doing to Canada change from day to day. It's gone through an entire series of reasons. And that happens across the board, where there's not, there's a foregone conclusion that someone is an enemy or someone's in a weaker position and has, in spite of that, been taking advantage of the United States. And then the response is a very reactive, punitive response that glosses over really any kind of reasoning that could stick. So the reasoning isn't the point. The point is the affective posture of lashing out at an enemy according to general categories that have been preset and ascribe that status. And it's very hard to get out of that circle.
Well, many people think that you know, that voters will vote him out, and also that the young people are going to change everything. And I thought about that when you were critiquing post-normativity as not just post-normativity, but you call it normopathy. And I thought, is that true? So that's what's happening in the Trump planned post-normativity. That's a thing in itself. And you also mentioned the leftists and the micro-fascist moves of cancel culture or transphobic feminism, which of course we have all been feeling the effects of for some time. But then there's this idea that there's this generation that this is another thing that has happened, and it's very intricately involved in the pro-Trump men that I have been spending time with over the last couple of years. What has happened to their children? That they're weak, that they have problems, that they're, changing their genders. These things feel like that's what they experience as fathers, as a world out of control and a problem that they can't solve. So they think, well, the women have to stop treating them like babies. We're going to do these, I'm going to do these things with them, but they don't really know. And they're not being mean about their children, but it's an issue that has played a role in the situation that we find ourselves in, whether we think that that's going to be the salvation and that this is a very different form of post-normativity where the kids just don't believe in gender anymore. There has been this shift. And then that moves into the pro-Trump thing in complicated but powerful ways, as does COVID, is also a major issue for many of the people that I've talked to, because that's some kind of, a vulnerability, some kind of fucked up situation that happened where we couldn't believe the medical experts and so on and so forth. Everything just seemed to fall apart. So it's not just the economy that they're talking about, and it's not just some of these people don't love Trump at all, but they think things are fucked up. And an issue is that the post-normativity of the younger people. I don't think you wrote about that post-normativity, did you?
I did, as part of, yes, I did write about it as part of the post-normative condition. When I talked about normopathy, I was talking about a certain kind of cruelty that's inherent in the norm, because it's always trying to impose a standard and impose a certain conformity of behavior on bodies that can be experienced as a um, as a cutting, as an amputation, as an attack on those bodies. It's also I also talked about in the sense of an exaggerated masculinity, a hyper masculinity that tries to prove itself too much,
Right.
and in the process of doing that, shows the weaknesses that are inherent in its constitution. Now, if the standard of man and a standard of whiteness is a kind of attacking cookie cutter that's pushed over the shape of people's lives and cuts off aspects of it that can be viewed as tortures, as amputations. There's a kind of post-normativity, which is when people are free to actually follow those parts of themselves where they might lead, where they can leak out of the standard of man, leak out of those general categories, and create singular modes of relation with the world and with them, with their own bodies, with their sexuality, and with people around them that don't fall into those same molds. So there's a kind of escape or a leakage out of normativity. And I think that the rage of reaction in the end is most against that, because that's the possibility that a leakage could start to make the cracks bigger, that they could pool together, that they could start creating the conditions for another world where Trump and Musk and Silicon Valley billionaires were not in control. So I think what Trump does, he doesn't rule as a traditional leader. He doesn't pass legislation. He doesn't follow the norms of government. He works in a state of exception, attributing to himself an exceptionality as a person. And what he does is throw out primes, throw out provocations, signs that impinge, that are designed in a way that revive reactive, that create reaction and revive reactive tendencies. And he claims decisional power based on how that seems to resonate with people across the social field, so that his legitimation isn't from an ideology, or it isn't from a program that he's rationally following through with. It's from his ability to stir reactive tendencies and stir the commotions in a way that circulates back through him, swells his person, and then can move back again into the social field. So he's ruling by dictate. He's ruling by executive order.
Right.
And he's dealing with that almost as the same way he deals with tweets, where he's throwing out executive order after executive order. Some land, some are overturned, some aren't. But in the chaos, a lot of things can be done, and most of what could be done is a dismantling of the governmental guarantees that were in place. So when people who think, well, he'll be voted out next time, it's not clear that there will be a next time of an actual fair election. He just took federal control over the election process.
Right.
He is
Yeah, that's people
using,
having dreams that as if liberalism is still here, in my
yes, yeah.
view. This will
And I
return,
think the
go back.
first, yeah. So I think in addition to trying to sensitize ourselves and act differently within the relational encounters that we have in the everyday, I think we have to really start training ourselves out of thinking that there is a politics as usual that we can return to. We can't. That there really is no, I don't think there's a choice except to try to move toward a different kind of situation. Um, and a lot of the troubling things that are happening really makes it difficult to believe that we would be able to go back. The extent to which, for example, the universities and major law firms have been cowed into acquiescence through basically mafia-style blackmail. It's taking people's rights to express themselves, but also to be he's trying to destroy the ability of his opponents to be represented in court.
Right.
It's a multi-pronged attack, and he's
And it feels,
throwing out provocations all the time in a kind of quasi-chaos. And it's the quasi-chaos and what can be done in that, rather than the particular promulgation of a certain order that is his decisional mode, and that he's made, and is how he's making changes.
yeah. And it also feels like this has been building, not just in the sense that fascism's little bits and pieces have always been there, but in the development of the economy in the US, where the universities are corporations, and they act very differently from the way we think universities used to work or should work or something like that. So it feels like there's this whole house of cards that has tumbled down after, centuries of the decomposition of things, and in the face of all kinds of violence, state and otherwise, in the US. So it feels like a kind of upswelling of a bunch of shit that has been going on.
Yeah, and it does feel like a catalytic point, like a turning point.
Yeah,
If you think
right.
back 3 months and try, it's difficult almost to keep track of what's happened day to day. It's just daily attacks and provocations, and so much has been done in just that amount of time. The way Trump is acting now is very similar to what he was doing in the first term, but it's brought it to a much more intensive sort of manic level. And unlike the first term, there is an ideological apparatus adjacent to him that he draws on, even if he's not operating in terms of ideological adherence and more a junction to affective dynamics. There is the right-wing think tank world,
Right.
the Heritage Foundation and Project 2025, and there's a kind of forming of a certain agenda through Trump's chaos that is very directed. And one of the things that normally characterizes fascism, unlike a lot of totalitarianisms, is that they never call into question private property and the basic tenets of liberal capitalism. And in fact, they often unleash it the way that Milei has also been doing in Argentina. So there's an extreme deregulation, destruction of oversight agencies, and bringing into the center of the action the people like Musk, who have very corrupt relations to the government, where they're sourcing contracts and furthering their own interests through it.
Right.
And it's a kind of exacerbation of the deregulation tendencies and many other tendencies in neoliberalism, with this sort of reactive aspect thrown in of the tariffs and setting up a national barrier in order to ascribe enemy status basically to everything outside the borders of the United States. And
Yeah.
those two dynamics are working together. They're not the same dynamics, but they're coupled in the way that fascism is crystallizing.
Right. And you can see the fascist nebula spreading here in Connecticut. This week, I had 2 encounters with women who that turned to racism.
Mhm.
And one was a crazy, probably Trumper person who was complaining about, it started with transgender. It's all one package. The kids, and she works as a cafeteria worker in a school, and she switched schools, and she went to a middle school instead of the high school, and they were worse because their bodies and their language. And she didn't say that she was talking about Black people, but she said, you know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
And I thought that was interesting because in Connecticut, there's this bizarre phrase that's a kind of a humble social marker where people say, sometimes people say it at the end of every sentence, know what I mean? Know what I mean? Know what I mean? And it's been transferred in this situation into a direct interpolation into this, you're in a category with me in some way because you're in this neighborhood, because you're white, whatever.
And we're joined in a
And we're
certain sense of what
in
common
this thing, and this direct with eye contact. You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
You know what
You
I'm
know what
talking
I'm talking about. It's already known. It's a foregone conclusion. It's just common sense.
Right.
And if you think it's not, and you think you have to think then
And what
you're
is
elite
common
and you
sense?
fall into that enemy's category.
Common sense is such a weird concept too. Think about it in relation to your and Aaron's concept of thought in the act, or the singularity of encounters. Those are forms of common sense, but this common sense is about not having to think about anything. Why should I have to think about what I'm going to call you, what your pronoun is, or something like that? It's a reaction. It's
Well,
a
a
reaction to thinking.
sense of the common is different from common sense. If you think of the common in terms of that field of relation that we all cohabit together,
Right.
not in the sense of being the same, cohabiting in the same way, but we differentially cohabit. The sense of the common is a sense of difference and differentiation, and it's a welcoming of difference. People are not expressing gender in the same way. How interesting. Why is that a threat? Why is something to be to think about, to marvel at, to support.
Right.
But common sense is a set of general categories with general ways of that have general certain ways of certain functions attached, certain modes of interaction, all that are assumed as the background. So all you have to do is move around the general categories, but you're not actually moving around the thinking. You're just moving around the reactive response.
Right. Right. And I was also interested in your concept of systemic stupidity in the fascism. You know, everybody calls Trump stupid. And then there's discussions about that all of the time. But you talk about systemic stupidity when the fascism misrecognizes its own moves as concrete. And also enters into a kind of a self-referential loop because it loses contact with what we would think of as common sense. And it's not interested in common sense, doesn't answer common sense questions at all. There's no sense of it. Like, you know, it's like power, as you say, I think that's completely beyond evidence or common sense, any of the common senses. It's a kind of a really loose, flying form of power that has no checks, is another way to think about what is happening.
Yeah, I think it's really, sorry, Kent, can I know you probably want to go questions. Can I just finish this one off?
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's really, really important to think about stupidity because we're in a reign of error. But it's just as important not to think of stupidity as a personal attribute. It's not the same thing to say that there is a systemic
Right.
stupidity afoot and to say that the people who do these things are stupid. It's not at all the same thing. It's that
Right.
there's certain posturings, anglings into the world, existential postures, certain modes of thought, modes of affectivity that lend themselves to error and that inflate the kinds of error that I was talking about that has to do with reaction, which basically boils down to judging the particular in the image of the general. That person has black skin, therefore, and thinking that the general and the particular is all there is in the field of relation, because in addition to that, there are all of the variations that are singular, that are the details that can't fit into the particular, that are discounted by the general category as it takes up the particular into its fold. All of the leakages, the anomalies, the sort of odd details that don't fit. Those aren't just things to be discounted. Those are things that, in a sense, have a life of their own. They have potential tendencies, and they can be rebundled and rewoven in ways that create new worlds.
Well, that's hopeful.
Okay. So we have a bunch of questions from some smart questions. We have about 7 minutes, so that seems unlikely we're going to get to them all. But if we run over a couple minutes, I think that's okay. But let me bundle 3 of the questions first and then the other 2 afterwards. I think this is going to work. Sherry Ostapovich asks, this may be too structuralist. Good opening. But could you discuss the relationship between neo/liberalism and its influence on fascism as we've been seeing it over the last decade plus? In her opinion, their opinion, the logical extension of neoliberalism is fascism, but perhaps you have a more process-based conception around it. And then I'm going to add in 2 others. Che Gossett asks, thanks so much for this, Brian. I'm wondering if you can talk about Trump's relationship to the state. I'm reminded of Ruth Wilson Gilmore's formulation of the anti-state state, wherein there's an authoritarian weaponization of the state, while also a radical undoing of its institutional infrastructure. And then third, Chad Shimura. We have a really good set of questioners here. Thank you both for the generative conversation. Brian, I'm drawn to your description of fascism as an enduring recurrence with variations. It reminds me of your theorization of ontopower in your book of that name, which was published a decade ago already. Is fascism today a kind of ontopower? If so, how might anti-fascism be calibrated accordingly? How might anti-fascism act against, upon, or perhaps even as an ontopower of its own? I feel this might connect to your comments on Nietzsche and Spinoza and what Katie described as deactivating reaction.
Okay, you're going to have to remind me as I go through the answers. I'll start with the last because it's the freshest in my mind. Yes, I think that fascism, as it's operated today, is a form of ontopower. And by ontopower, I mean a power to bring to be, toward the expression of a determinate form. So a power that operates on a field of emergence rather than on already fully constituted emerged things. And I think that's what fascism does when it reaches down to the level of our reactive tendencies that are built into our everyday perceptions, that it's jostling the way our bodies and selves are put together in a way that regenerates variations on them. It's constitutive of the person. It's not a power over already formed persons. It's a formative power of personification. So that is an ontopower in the way I was trying to talk about it. So the question about neoliberalism, I think I might have a different viewpoint than a lot of people. I don't think that capitalism is fascist. I think it accommodates itself to fascism. And unleashes and carries fascist tendencies. But processually, I think of certain operators or certain sort of key axes of organization. And they're different for fascism and for capitalism. For fascism, it's that axis that goes from an intruder or an impingement to the ascription of enemy status based on an inflated and conflated general category. So it goes from the impingement of the outside and the other to the ascription of an enemy and the reactive responses that flow from that. I think that's probably at the core axis of fascism, and that all of the other operators and tendencies that enter in constellate around it in various forms. For capitalism, it's something very different. It's the formula of capital itself, which is the possibility to generate a greater quantity of capital from a given quantity of capital. So it's this drive to an excess over every given quantity that is surplus value. And it generates that by imposing certain relations, a certain differential between what in the older, more structured world were workers against capitalists, but are now people who only have access to money as a means of payment and people who have access to money as a means of investment. And that axis of the money axis, as it's driven by this sort of delirious movement of constantly capital self-overcoming itself in greater excess in relation to itself. Those are two separate things. So I see them as two processes that couple rather than as one amalgamation. There's so many things that are in continuity with neoliberalism right now. The dominance of the financial sector, the figure of the worker being replaced by the figure of human capital, or what Foucault called the enterprise subject, the entrepreneur of oneself, where one's own life is thought of as a form of added value, producing capacity that takes over all aspects of one's life. There's the shrinkage of social services and a move toward privatization, which is starting to rev up right now with Doge and what Trump is doing. There's, along with that tendency toward human capital, there's a shift that's taken place where people think of themselves as on the model of an enterprise, often creating themselves as businesses through sole proprietorship companies. And they see their participation in the economic field not in terms of labor, but in terms of asset ownership, owning a home being the most important one and the point of entry. So they see themselves as manipulators of capital and as capital themselves that are sort of creating capitalizing the conditions of their lives so they can produce more. And I think that's a movement, I think, inherent in neoliberalism that is being brought out more and more, and I think has a lot to do with people's adherence to Trump because they're aspirationally owners of businesses. So and the large-scale capitalists we see now who are at the forefront are less and less people who are at the head of shared stock companies and publicly traded companies, and are examples of what's called patrimonial capitalism, which is that their personal ownerships or their family are owners, and it's an extension of sort of the human capital model. So in all those ways, neoliberalism is still here, but what's different now is that the globalization vector of neoliberalism is being called into question. The first one, I forgot what it was, the first question.
That was the first.
That was the
I thought
first
it was
one,
the state.
the anti-state state.
Anti-state.
But I
Okay.
was going to ask Katie if she wanted to chime in on neoliberalism.
I just want to say that we have to watch out for liberalism, not just neoliberalism, but what is happening with liberalism. I think it's very important right now.
Mhm. So for the anti-state state, I think that makes a lot of sense. I draw a lot on Carl Schmitt, who was a Nazi juror who created a very fascinating theory of state and decision, where he says that the sovereign is the person who decides in exceptional circumstances or declares exceptional circumstances, and they perform an act of ascription of the enemy that draws the entire social body. It sort of channels feelings of existential threat in the social body and draws them together in a movement of attack toward the ascribed enemy. And all that is performative in the sense that it's a statement that does what it that does while saying. It's a proclamation. It catalyzes something simply by being said. So I think that Trump's, the way he wields power is through that form of decision, that performative form of decision, through the ascription of enemies and the channeling of existential threats of one intensity or another toward reactive attack on ascribed enemies. Schmitt says that is the state. He's saying the government is not the state in his sovereign sense, because the government is normative, and it's ruled by regulations and negotiation, and the administrative state is a regulatory body. It's not a decision body that's creating these sort of lightning strike ascriptions that brace the social body into a channeling toward attack. So he says that form of decision that he calls the sovereign, and he says is personal, not in the sense that it's what a particular individual wants, but it channels through a person who is the singular point through which the collective fear and desire channels. So he said in his vocabulary, that's the state, and then the government is something else, and the people are something else again. And that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think that fits in with that anti-state state vocabulary. That this is the anti-state, if you think anti-government state, and he's practicing, I think, Schmittian decision by decree, but just as effectively decision by tweet, that are performative, that create effects simply by being enunciated, and that change the situation in quasi-chaotic ways that have to be worked out from there, and then that quasi-chaos can be exploited by various actors allied with Trump.
So we're about 5 minutes over. Do you want to take 2 more questions, or should we close? I can read you the questions, then you could decide. Or,
Okay.
but this has been so generous and generative, and so many people really grateful. Do you want to close up, or?
Well, we can have 2 more, sure.
They're both like kind of how do we move from this position kind of questions. One, like doubting, what brought us here, and the other about what to do with your account. I'll start with the second. That's Christoph Brunner. I would like to hear some elaborations of the operationalization of redundancy to uphold the reactive foreclosure of the reactive. How to insert difference, deviate the foreclosure, make the minor fascist tendencies stumble. Feels like Katie's example of the one sentence being repeated over and over again is a prime example for the redundancy. Thank you. And then Gail Hamner, in a, I think, more on our minds version, says, thank you both for this wonderful discussion. I'd be grateful for more elaboration of how our present is post-normative or post-apathetic, when to me it feels like the old norms of nostalgic, patriarchal, Christian white supremacy are doubling, tripling down. Maybe precisely because we have been in an incredibly generative moment of norm breaking and new norm making, particularly around gender and kinship. Queers and trans communities do have norms, yes. How are we understanding norm that you no longer see the cruel cutting of the norm, or Trump's current hateful actions as not reinstating very specific traditional norms, perhaps precisely along the bulleted agenda of Project 2025? Is it perhaps dangerous to assume that Trump's chaotic and seemingly affect-driven performance does not have a quite calm lockstep logic behind it? That's a long question.
Yeah, I don't think it has a lockstep logic behind it, but I do not think that the norm is dead. That's not what I mean by a post-normative condition. What I mean is, well, if you go back to the idea of legitimation and the usual way we think of leaders of the state being legitimated by an ideology or by a certain set of duties entrusted in them, and then they are legitimated by the adherence of the citizenry. That's not what happens with Trump. In fact, a majority of even Trump voters disagrees on many of his policies. The immigration is the one that there's the greatest agreement on, but then if you get into the details and say, do you want to do this even if it separates people from the families, then it goes below majority. They're not ideologically adherent in that way. And I think what I sort of lost my train of thought, but yeah, going back to the norms, I think what's happening is that, again, the Trump supporters don't necessarily have to embody the norm in the old traditional sense. A large number of them will, but they will actually, under these conditions, tend to take them to a hypermasculine extreme that becomes a kind of caricature of itself. So it's a kind, there's a kind of feeling of performance and even inauthenticity in it that isn't necessarily even attempted to be hidden. There's that hypering of the norm, and at the same time, there's the fact that if now that things are no longer being legitimated in that old way, what Trump is doing is giving license to people to express their resentments. And they can do that in often very in almost antisocial, anormal ways. So it's less, but then there's also always this default position of the traditional gender and race stereotypes, what I call the man standard, which is the same as whiteness. And that's always bringing the situation back toward a certain kind of predictability or a certain kind of structuring. But if you think of normality as a normal curve, it seems to me that it's oscillating around from one side to the next, not staying in the center, and that it's creating effects through that oscillation, giving options to take license in ways that break the norms. And then there's certain groupings that specialize in that. There are groups that are on the far right that are quite anti-moral, like the Boogaloo Boys, who make fun of the Christian right and the sort of moral standards of behavior. So it seems, yeah. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that post-normativity includes the norms, but it especially includes their intensification and their expression in hyper forms. But it also gives license for people not to meet the norms. So incels will be as Trumpian as Andrew Tate, because they can't live up to the norm, but they're given license to be the way they are in relation to the norm.
That's great. So it's about 12 after, so I think we probably should really close up. But I'm just so grateful to both of you for being here and sharing this. Clearly, many people from Aotearoa and Australia listening in, and from around the globe. And thank you for sharing this really thoughtful and necessary stirring, as somebody called it, of ideas and thinking. And thank you especially, Brian and Katie, both of you, for being what we needed at this great time. So it's not great time.
Thank you, Ken.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Ken, and Stephanie too.
Okay.
Yeah,
And Katie, as always.
it's great, Brian.
Everybody, thank you very much. Take care.
Take care.
Bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.